everyone. Welcome to the second session of today's summit, Assessing Your Content for Maximum Engagement Outcomes. With us for today's session, we are lucky to have Emma Neckman, Event Marketing Lead with CS. And welcome, Emma. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Leslie. I'm so glad to be here, and hey to our audience today. It's great to be part
All
of this.
right. One programming note we do want to make, we unfortunately cannot be joined by Kathy Jordan, our other panelist today, but we will carry on in her absence and make her proud with the education and tips we're going to provide to everybody. So let's jump right in. I want to just give everybody a brief description of the session in case you weren't able to look at it or you're joining us a little bit late. In this session, we're going to talk about how you assess your existing content to translate it to a digital audience. So we're going to look at existing content examples and what we would do to translate those over to a digital audience, and then review engagement elements, participation levels, and using feedback to incorporate those user wants for maximum engagement. So that's just anybody who wasn't able to look at that description, that is the current session you are in. Also, just one tip I want to clear up for anybody who wasn't able to join us on the first session, welcome. I do want to go through the definition of a parallel event really quickly, just so everybody knows what we're jumping into and the exact event format we're looking at. So we are defining this as an event format that's designed for digital participants with a focus on engagement. So it's modified content from an in-person event to keep it interesting and active for your digital participants. And most importantly, it's creating that unique experience for your online audience. You're crafting your entire event around your online, as opposed to, let's say, a hybrid where you're just streaming content to them so they can interact and be able to see it. You're actually crafting this for their own modalities, their own experiences. So I just wanted to set the stage for that, Emma, before we jump into content for anybody who wasn't able to join us. So
Perfect.
I want to start off today. Content, we say content is king. We know it is. It's never going to go away. That's going to be the most important thing to us. So I first want to set the stage here about discussing why some session formats or engagement activities do not translate well to digital. We've all been a part of it. I think we talked about it a little bit in the first session of telling inside jokes and talking about receptions that digital attendees weren't at, and it automatically sets up that isolation for these two audience types. So, Emma, do you want to give some examples or even real life examples of session formats you've seen that don't translate well and why you think they don't translate well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought, like, first of all, being part of this and the concept of parallel events is really interesting to me because I came from the space that we were doing the hybrid events, right? Like way back in the day, I feel like at the dawn of virtual events with a hybrid component. So I know firsthand a lot of things that we just really tried to light up for that digital audience from a live event that completely fell flat. I want to look at it from a couple of perspectives. One being like the physical space limitation, one being the production limitation that really makes those sort of in-person experiences, even down to like maybe the snacks and coffee in the room that you can't get when you're doing this as a digital version. So I think one thing that it doesn't work if you're doing, in particular, I know we're looking at some breakout session examples.
Mm-hmm.
We've all seen in the physical room when I'm an engaged attendee in the space and I'm raising my hand and asking questions. Unless there's a microphone in my hand, the digital audience is not going to be able to hear my question. Again,
Right.
like whiteboarding activities, it just makes it takes that element out completely for somebody who might be tuning in at home, just watching video because they can't see or hear half of the content. And obviously, what do we think is going to happen? They won't retain any of it, and they'll have a bad experience, which is the antithesis of engagement.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's, I mean, we touched on that before. We all talked about our real life experiences of feeling
Right.
left out. And you hit the nail on the head when you said it even goes down to those snacks. I mean, I don't eat Cheez-Its, but if they're available at an in-person event, I'm somehow eating them. It's just something, it's like
Exactly.
you're a product of the environment. So you want to make that environment welcoming for engaging if you're thinking of your attendees or your participants as that product of that environment.
Absolutely. And I think another thing too, we need to look at things as we've shifted. I mean, when we went fully digital for a while, right? I think now that we're kind of on the other side of things, even duration of some of these
Mm-hmm.
sessions that maybe in person fit for like a 90-minute slot, that sort of thing, it just feels a bit too long for the digital format. I love like the way that we're going through today to make sure that we're kind of condensing,
Mm-hmm.
trimming some of like those fluff elements. and just giving people at home in the digital experience something that they can like get key takeaway, tangible information from, but without any of like those things that are just going to inhibit that. We obviously not being able to see or hear anything is a huge one that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I love you saying the duration and the fluff, because how
Yeah.
many times, raise your hand if you've been supporting a digital event where everybody out there is asking you what exact time the speaker is going to come on, because you have the CEO coming on, you have sponsors, you have all these things that they add into the introduction that digital audience members just don't want to see. And they're just waiting and waiting. And the other enemy of being in person, starting on time. We all know that we've
Right.
gotten behind, and that does affect your digital audience. It puts a bad taste in their mouth, because when we're talking about how much time commitment they're putting in, if they're sitting there waiting for 45 minutes while, let's say, you've got like somebody performing, there's interpretive dancers on stage, they don't want to
Right.
see that. So you're already setting them up to have maybe a negative experience when you could easily fix that with a parallel event. So that's a great point. So I want to shift into talking about mindsets, because obviously we're all on here. We have different levels of experience. We do different tasks. And I myself went from creating digital content to in person to digital. So it's a little bit easier to know what to translate. But how do you really get in that mindset to create content for a digital audience? How do you go from, let's say, creating solely in person to now having to shift that thinking of crafting that for a digital audience?
Right. And I think that starts, I think, even at the point when you're working with your presenters, right, who might have
Mhm.
already formulated their content for the in-person, and then they're like, wait a minute, I have to like reinvent, create something completely different. No, you definitely don't. So that's nice, right? We can definitely package up the existing content, which makes it a lot easier on the speakers, a lot easier on the prep, and just look at the different items that really would make sense in the digital format, right? I think highly visual. I want to name the things that, again, I've been in this game for a while, but some of the things that you have to consider when you are formatting. Some of that is just making sure that it is highly visual, including any sort of
Mhm.
like pre-recorded video elements, more like discussion style, like true engagement. So you're not just sitting there with PowerPoint slides. For me, I really think maybe PowerPoint slides feels better at times in person, right? But when I'm
Mhm.
at home, I need something more. And again, I don't want to scare anyone in the audience to think that they have to create and produce these highly produced pieces here, but just something simple like that. Just making sure that you are incorporating storytelling. Utilizing any sort of engagement tools that you have. Leslie, we were like prepping for this. You have to also think about A, what the audience wants to get out of it, and B, the comfort level of the audience. So for
Mhm.
instance, if we're doing digital breakout sessions, we can set the expectations of, what the audience behavior and their participant level should look like prior to
Mhm.
the event. So there's no surprises, right? Nobody likes surprises. And I think for some of like those longer, maybe like the keynote sessions, if we can have like making sure that there is still a voice for our
Mhm.
digital attendees, whether it's participating in the chat, even doing reactions that we've seen, like applauding, I think goes a long way to pepper in those elements to just really make it connect. I don't want to steal the thunder when we're going through the examples and kind of the methodology. That we can look at to really like go piece by piece to translate these items. But I do want to tell the audience it's not scary, right? This is not hard. The content already exists. There's a couple things that we can do, and also like rinse and repeat and templatize to make it easy going forward.
Yeah, and there's nobody's saying kill your PowerPoints, because we actually touched on that in our first session,
Right.
Emma, too.
Don't
It's
kill your
just
PowerPoint.
that think of what you really need to put in there, but also how much information you're trying to fit into a duration. I gave the example of seeing a speaker trying to fit hundreds of slides into an hour-long session, and if you
Right.
think about it, that's more than one slide a minute. I mean, there's no way you're going to get retainment and engagement from that. And then that's not setting up your speaker for success either, because then they're getting the feedback that it was too much. I couldn't follow any of it. And you really need to protect both. You need to protect both your speakers and your audiences when you're kind of crafting that content around that digital mindset.
For sure.
So no thunder stealing, just quick tips on what you could do. And we actually touched
Yeah.
on this in the engagement activity prior to this, is the visuals, the need for visuals on screen. because of fatigue or other people saying they don't want to sit at a screen, make them want to. There's got to be some kind of visual, some kind of activity that would make them want to. Because
Absolutely.
I'm going to call out Benny. One of our participants made a great point in our engagement activity that, I mean, he doesn't have fatigue. He watches YouTube. He's on Facebook. It's on a screen. So obviously, there's
Right.
not that much screen fatigue happening with the different habits, the different things that we do in our everyday lives.
Absolutely. And it's not easy, right? I mean, coming from like my past life, working with clients all that ran the gamut of industries, right, to where I'm at now. As a planner, as an event planner, it's creating like the recipe to these, like, to make it easy on people so they're not overwhelmed. So here's what I recommend. If you don't want someone showing up with 100 slides, like fast-paced, crazy PowerPoint, I always provide a slide template and say, like, hey, we're looking for, in some cases, maybe 5 to 7 highly visual slides. Then we get a draft in and then have it revamped to be even more visual. So if there's lots of text on screen, I remind a lot of my presenters throughout my career, just drop those in the speaker notes, right? Just keep the images up. And if we can kind of have like people try to stick within a template, and also create rules that every presentation for digital, we need to kick things off with a polling question. This can be something that is a simple knowledge check or just something fun to break the ice. I feel like now people are a bit more comfortable with this format. So it at times it depends on the audience, like their comfort level and actually
Right.
giving back. But I think if you have something like that off the bat, also creating PowerPoint slides that literally say, like, I have a visual on screen says, let's talk. Like, I want to direct a question for you, the audience. Tell me in the chat, tell me in this poll, how are you feeling? From the presenter side, it goes a long way because I don't feel like I'm sitting in an empty room and it's just like not feeding off the energy from the crowd. I'm getting some sort of reaction. The
Right.
more I do it, the more I can kind of play into that. So I think templatizing and pre-planning, setting simple expectations up front to make sure that we are not getting back those 100 PowerPoint slides really goes a long way. And especially if you're doing like digital events over and over again, you kind of create like that's a template. That's what people
Yeah.
expect. And it's a culture shift. So it becomes a bit easier. So that's
Yeah. No, and those are great points. And speaking of engaging and asking in the chat, Ron, do we have any questions or suggestions of from any of the tips that Emma's giving out that we want to touch on?
right. And that is $1 million question, Ron. A lot of times that sometimes the subject matter expert does not have the showcase personality to drive conversation, to be engaging. I started my career speaker coaching floor traders at the Chicago Board Options Exchange who were incredibly smart, like the world's top knowledge level of the information they were sharing, but flat as a pancake personality. So I didn't know anything about options trading, but I could come in and bring out some personality. So I always say, if you have a SME that might just be like the person to go to for knowledge, you have to pair them with somebody in your organization. I've worked in Chicago most of my life. There's a huge improv community. There's always people around the office that you can kind of turn into this role if they're interested, right? And you have the opportunity. But pair that SME with somebody who's a little bit outgoing, familiar, and comfortable, because it can make it that much more elevating. And it's better for the audience and also better for that person, so they're not like feeling they have to go at it alone. That's my best advice. That's tried and true over my many years at this.
Yeah, and that, I mean, that's a great question because you also get people who might be great at in person and they're horrible at digital.
Totally.
They
And it
just they
happens
can't
all the
take it.
time.
Yeah,
Right.
they can't take not seeing people's reactions and playing off them, and then it's awful. And it's not like you set them up for that. You weren't thinking that it would be that much different for them to present to a digital, but you have to look at that aspect too, because some people might be great in person and they feed off the
Mm-hmm.
energy, and then digitally they just cannot do it. So
Totally.
that's a great question and something you really need to look at because it's tough. And I mean, while some people may tell you they want to do it, they may freeze up. We see that a lot too.
Yeah.
Um,
I've seen that
so
happen.
it's tough, but it's something that you can do. And we said this in the last session too, to really look at your existing team members and volunteers that you have, because they might have some hidden talent like improv or like theater that they just don't showcase at work every day because it's not appropriate, but that they could actually help you out on those sessions. That's a great question. So,
Absolutely.
with that, I want to segue into we've been talking about tangible and having tangible
Yeah.
takeaways. So, I do want to take a little time and show people some kind of mock content we created that's in person and what we could do to take it digital. So, I'm going to talk to my woman behind the curtain, Raina, and I'm going to ask you to pull up our first slide. What we're going to do here is just show you a title of a session and some characteristics of its in-person session. And then Emma's going to really give you some tips for what you could do or what you could see when you're translating that to a digital.
Perfect.
All right, so let's go through the first one. Emma, I'm going to read the title for everybody too, just so we can keep on the same page. This is Bridging the Gap, Creating Engagement with Audience Where It's Lacking. So the thought behind this was actually hybrid, when we had hybrid as the showcase, as the display of how you connected those two in-person and digital audiences. And it was a session that we actually did a couple of years ago to help people kind of bridge that gap and connect those audiences better. So for some of the in-person characteristics on this one, it's group work, which we will talk about it in a second and how that might be complicated for digital, with a designated moderator, and then group work findings, reporting those back to a speaker. Who's going to do that? How you're going to have participants who actually aren't shy, who want to be the stand-up person to do that, and then illustrating example engagement activities. So that could be the speaker takes your feedback and they're going back and creating this thing in the room that you really want to see. So Emma, can you give us just some suggestions that you would have where you would turn this into a digital?
Yeah, absolutely. And then before I get into that, I just want to let everyone know we're looking at these formats from a 5-step methodology, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you can evaluate through this process, and we'll do this live in our engagement activity. But just at a high level, like reviewing the theme or message to make sure that the same would translate into different settings, in person and digital. Sometimes it doesn't, and we'll see that. But analyzing the engagement and participation level and its overall relevance to make sure that we're setting expectations, which in this example is a very big one. Evaluating attendee interest in their level in the subject matter, reflecting on group or engagement breaks, activities, and modifying to the different methods. And then also considering the speaker. Leslie, you touched on this. Keynote presenters, it's one thing, right? But you might have people that are way better suited for in-person with their teaching, their presentation style that we might need to tailor a bit. So for this particular example, and we'll look at these examples from a bit different perspective, so I can just cover, as much as we can here.
Yeah.
But I think here for the breakouts, and I would love to hear from you all too. I don't know like the level of production value, planning resources, tools that you're using, but the thing that stands out here and anything that we're doing sort of breakouts is making sure that we are very clear on the roles and responsibilities. So identifying the breakout leaders, predetermining who those groups are, sharing out who's in those groups, perhaps with the participants. I think it's really important to me if I can take a look at who is in my breakout group, because it also encourages me to, if I have my peers in there, if I have competitors, colleagues, whatever it is in the certain situation, I will want to be able to be my best as an active participant amongst my peers. So I think that providing that information to set expectations beforehand and with simple rules of engagement for the digital breakout attendees that say, like, we need you to have your webcam on. We'll be asking for your participation, whether it be verbally or if you're not comfortable, please make sure you're an active participant in chat, Q&A, polling, to set those expectations up front so we're not in a situation where the room is silent, right? It's much harder to do when we're in person because you're right in front of somebody. But I'm easy. I can turn off my camera and just, piece out of something like this. If I don't have those expectations set up and some sort of like FOMO, if I'm not my best for the group I'm with. So those key things doesn't take a lot, right? That it just is that level of planning to make sure that is seamless. It does go a long way for these digital breakout sessions.
Yeah, that's perfect. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Keep going.
Go ahead.
No, I think that's what you said is really key, because the thing we're trying to drive home today is you can walk away anytime. So that's why this seems like it might be so complicated for designing for digital, because there's nothing stopping you from leaving. Whereas we all don't want to be the person in the room where you can hear the door close when they leave,
Right.
and it's embarrassing. So,
Right.
so no, that's a great point of still with this theme we're going through of competing with those distractions with digital.
Exactly. And I think in a situation like this too, are we really, do we want our digital audience to be, what do we want them to do with like this information that they compile? Like put it in action, submit somewhere? Because in this case, illustrating an example of an engagement activity as a whole. So let's say like you go in your breakout rooms and come back and present. I don't even know. I don't even know if it's necessary for this. So that might be an example of something that might work well in the in-person, but not really for digital. I mean, we could easily submit our findings through email. They can be compiled and then have like a post-event follow-up with our findings versus kind of the awkward, like, okay, let me turn my webcam on. I'm gonna tell you like about what I wrote down. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
eliminate it. And that's
Well,
fine.
and I wanna throw this audience question out to you because it's a good
Yeah.
one, because it's something I think about all the time. Is it okay to cold call participants in an engagement activity to get them to participate? So I'll let you go there first, and then I'll kinda give some ideas too.
Right. And I mean, theoretically, of course you could. You run the risk then of putting somebody on the spot, making them feel incredibly uncomfortable, which might result in a bad experience. It just kind of depends. But I think when you do set those expectations and the rules of engagement as the participant beforehand, then you avoid that situation. And
Mhm.
if you give them the tools, if they're not comfortable responding verbally, then make sure that they are active in the chat. Have your own people be what we call the chat cheerleaders in there to keep the conversation going, break the ice. You don't have to run into that situation.
Yeah, I think if you're setting expectations prior that
Mm-hmm.
could happen, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if you told me that you were gonna call on me during a meeting and then I act shocked when you do it, that's on me, for not really thinking that you were gonna do that. But I think it is because also, like I said, you don't want your speaker to also have a negative experience, because if I had people who weren't reacting to anything that Emma and I were saying, I would think we missed the mark on something, that
Right.
there's something we didn't cover, or it went way over your head and we lost you. So you're also wanting your speaker to have that positive experience too. So I think if you're setting expectations prior, it's completely okay and sometimes necessary to cold call participants for participation, for engagement.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We'll get there.
All right. Let's move into our next example. So, Raina, if you could pull that up, this is reformatting sessions to reach all learners. So, again, this content is a couple of years old, so you might have already done things like this. But this is really intensive group work where people are talking about example learning styles, listing characteristics, and then going a step further where they're electing a person to speak directly with your speaker or your panelist, to share with the collective audience and create a session together. So, Emma, what suggestions would you have for this to take this digital?
Right. And this is another that just do like to like the brain power in these smaller groups, right? In this sort of format. It might be handled as maybe a pre-work activity where you're tasked with meeting with these groups beforehand and then actually using the session to truly share the findings because it's easier to coordinate that way. Another thing that I thought would really translate nicely to digital was through the simple use of polling questions. Or if you don't have polling questions, just asking for feedback in a chat or maybe a word cloud where you're coming up with I think it's the 3 examples of learning styles, and then perhaps
Yeah.
listing characteristics under, and then having the audience weigh in on what they feel maybe are top 3, top 5. Because then we're crowdsourcing the knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're getting everybody to participate in the mode that they're comfortable with, without trying to finagle these smaller groups and coordination there, which can be a bit messy. So I think if we can handle some of that either through quick pre-work, again, we don't want to bog anybody down with too much going on at times, right, when appropriate, or
Mm-hmm.
handling that ideation live through the use of polling questions, word clouds, and then having somebody who acts as kind of like the scribe, we'll call it, sharing and leading those conversations. So I think that would be a great way to get people to participate without having like that silence in the room.
Yeah, and I like that term. I like the scribe. Somebody use that in their next event. I love that. I would nominate myself to be a scribe. I think that's great.
Absolutely, absolutely. And
Um,
there's a couple of roles for any of these things. Like you need a scribe, you need like a moderator, you need the person putting the seed questions in the Q&A to lighten up the audience to get the things flowing,
mhm.
and somebody just participating in the chat so that people can see what's going on and feel comfortable participating. Little
Yeah.
things make a huge difference.
Yeah, and again, that's looking at those other team resources you have that could fill those
Right.
roles because you probably do have them in house if you just
Absolutely.
ask. And then the last one I want to pose to you is it's a little bit more complicated, a little bit more involved, is using event feedback to design your next event is the content example, and this is listing good feedback and poor feedback. So again, it's kind of not exactly group work, but you're still doing some interaction. And then in this one, there's a family feud game. So let's talk about how you would take interactions like that are super involved to a digital audience.
Absolutely. And I love this because it brings up gamification, which it's awesome. It's fun. Who doesn't love a game, right? Especially to break up the day, to break up my sessions if I'm in an online event. I'm sorry, a digital event. And for this, I think creating incentives is excellent. And we can look at it from like small to large, depending on your setup, budget, scale, all of that. But even something simple as awarding prizes. This can be handled through a follow-up email after the fact, sending Starbucks gift cards, or if you have the functionality to include leaderboards. People love seeing their name and lights and points associated with that. So anything like that, that again creates visibility amongst peers, gives somebody a nice little like feeling of that they've won something tangible. I love my Starbucks gift cards. I love anything like that. I can grab a coffee, and it just encourages me to participate that much more. Badging, we've all seen events that have a lot to do with badging and prize awarding for that. So I think with again, some of that prep, you can really do a lot to create incentive through gamification, and still have that like energy and fun. We used to do this. We created a trivia game just through basic webcasting technology. We had our host on video. All of the questions were timed with a timer and just handled through basic polling questions. So with a little imagination, you can use your tools at your fingertips from whatever you're using. It doesn't, I mean, it could be literally anything with a little creativity to create some sort of fun, engaging game out of it.
Yeah, and everybody knows, and everybody here can admit it, that they are competitive. How many times have we
Yes.
all seen a
Yes.
leaderboard that has no prize attached to it, but you want to be at the top of it and
Right.
you're watching it? Which there is a leaderboard on the crossword game in case anybody is taking those gamification breaks. But Emma, those are great suggestions, and we'll dive a little bit more into those in the engagement workshop because we're
Great.
actually going to take you through a short template of how you can assess your content. So, what you can look at to see how easily it would translate, or in some cases, if it wouldn't translate at all.
Right.
So, to wrap us up here with the last about 2 minutes, Emma, I just want to talk through those 5 steps that you could use
Sure.
to start your content assessment. So, you touched on that, we kind of went through them in a line there, but do you want to briefly share those with us or just give us some highlights over what we should start with those 5 steps?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like the place to start is obviously to pull up your entire full in-person event agenda. And we'll do this in the exercise, right? And then we'll look through some of the key pieces. Even we looked at the 3 breakout examples, but think about like your general session, your keynotes. Like we could like let's even look at the 5 steps with the looking at a keynote example here. So number 1, review the theme or message of session to ensure the same translation is possible in different settings. I'll even ask the audience. Keynotes generally tick both boxes there. We're paying a big ticket speaker to straight up hear their message. There's really not, it's more of like a show. I think of myself like, that's like the big key piece, right, Leslie? So I'd say, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, that's how you kind of look at it. 2, analyze the engagement or participation level and relevance to the overall session to set those expectations for the digital participants. So again, I think we went through some of those examples. That some of those pieces just they might not make sense, but you have to put yourself in like the shoes of somebody who's joining this either from their home or office to see really what they want to get out of it, and then kind of go from there with the way you're formatting it. And then evaluating the attendee interest level in a subject matter. I like to do that through general just audience feedback, whether that's through polling questions, or any sort of like crowdsourcing that we can do to see, you know, how well that's going to resonate with the audience. Sorry, I'm hearing like a lot of background noise. But and then reflect on group engagement and break activities and modifying. Again, we went through that in the example. If there's like heavily over engineered, like lots of group work, lots of whiteboarding, there are simpler ways to do that. It doesn't mean that we're not getting the value out of a big whiteboarding session. We're just looking at it differently, and making sure that we, that again, have something nice and tangible for those digital attendees to like take action on. And then of course, consider the speaker interest in presenting in a digital setting. It might be a culture shift, or you might need to pair that person with a moderator, or you might need to make some big changes altogether to just go a different direction with the presenter. And I think that that's okay too. But those 5 steps, I think, can really fit anything, like we said, from keynotes to breakouts, some of those general sessions, and really help you have like a nice recipe to put these all into play.
Yeah, and those are great. We'll touch on those again in our engagement activities. So nobody go anywhere. Remember, we do have these gamification breaks provided by Engamio. There's a crossword and pin yourself on the map. We want to see how much this is extending reach and where everybody is. So everybody take a brain break. I know we've had a lot of education coming in. We'll start our next engagement activity at 12:35 Central. So take a few minutes for yourselves. And Emma and I will see you back there to go through some more content assessment. Thank you, everybody.
Perfect.